Hi all, I am Tobin Krieg, a first-year student here at the Tech School of Business at Dartmouth, and on behalf of the PE and VC Center, thank you all for joining. Feel free to submit and vote on questions while we're talking, and welcome to the panel on AgTech Investing for the Future. Today we are joined by Phil Boyer, Dan Phillips, and Brett Brohl. Phil is a principal at Crosslink Capital. Phil is an investor with Crosslink Capital where he focuses on early stage investments in enterprise software and frontier technology. He's been investing in and working with technology companies for over a decade. And at Crosslink, his investments include Armory, BetterUp, Descartes Lab, Flow Technologies, Ironox, Weave, and others. Dan is a managing director at Cultivian Sandbox Ventures, a Chicago-based venture capital firm that invests in innovative startups developing solutions for the food and ag industry, including crop and protein production, food and safety and traceability, and novel food ingredients. Ben represents firms on the board of Culture Biosciences, Full Harvest, Geltor, Harvestport, and Philogen. Brett is a managing director at Techstars Farm to Fork. He is, which is partnered with Cargill and Ecolab. Brett is also the founder and managing partner of the Syndicate Fund, an early investor venture capital fund investing in retail, marketing, food and ag, and he is an experienced entrepreneur, investor, and mentor, driven by making a difference in the world through helping entrepreneurs succeed. He honed his startup skills as the CEO of multiple companies, leading 3 to exit. And check out his tips on best practices for founders and investors on his YouTube channel, Brett's Brain. Without further ado, let's jump right in. So my first question, just to get us started, is with increasing emphasis on integrating technology into all aspects of agriculture, both to improve efficiency and sustainability, there are many opportunities for startups to disrupt the conventional players across multiple market segments. So what market segments do you think are ripe for disruption, and what role do you think startups and investors will play in shaping those opportunities?
Sure, I'll start. This is Phil. So thanks for the intro, Tobin, and happy to be here. Thanks everyone for taking time out of your day to join. I guess from that on that question, I'll just kind of start from how we've come about the space and where we've focused a little bit in the ag tech landscape and why we think it's interesting. I'm with Crosslink Capital. We're early stage focused investors, so we look at a lot of seed and Series A rounds where we initially invest typically. And so the main thing we're looking for, right off the bat is just incredible founding teams, and that's always our kind of guiding light and our number one focus when we're looking at a new opportunity. But second to that, we're looking for massive, market opportunities where there's a lot of disruption potential and dislocation in the market. And we also tend to look for vertical industries and markets where perhaps they the market is both sufficiently large, but also behind in a number of areas in terms of innovation. And I think when you look at agriculture and food, the whole supply chain, there are, well, number one, it's $1 trillion plus industry, so big market check. But number two, much of it has not changed over over 100 years, hundreds of years. And so those are the kinds of things that, for us at Crosslink, we look at and say, hey, there's probably a lot of opportunities for startups and new entrants in this market to completely rethink, how things are done, and create a blank canvas and start to, redraw, how you should do things, and using today's technology, what can we do to completely reinvent and do things differently? So that's how we look at, this space at a high level, and we're comparing this space against a lot of different markets. So we're not just a vertical focused fund. We look at a lot of different verticals across technology. And I think, for us, agriculture, we've made a couple investments in this space because we view those core tenets to be really in place. Big market, really behind, a lot of dislocation. I think specifically, we've made a couple investments so far. One is a company called Descartes Labs, which you mentioned. which is taking really data science, AI, machine learning approach to macroeconomic indicators and being able to create basically predictive models to predict the future for crops and supply and demand of those crops. So we think there's a lot of those opportunities out there in the market to use data sets, scale out data sets, AI, machine learning in order to make agriculture, food, supply chain more efficient. So I think that's one specific area of interest. Another one would be if you look at agriculture in general and how things are done today, there is there's a lot of manual processes and a lot of manual very brute force kind of work that is being done. And you look at the labor issue in general, there's a labor shortage in the industry. There's an aging population on the farm. It's very expensive for farmers to actually run their businesses given where specialized labor costs are, and there's a lot of specialized labor that they are required to do their jobs. So you look at things like robotics and how you can automate a lot of key functions within the farm in order to be more efficient and augment your existing labor force. I think those are really interesting areas. So I'll stop now because I'll keep going down a rabbit hole and let the other guys chime in here. But I think like data, software data, and robotics are all very interesting pieces, and especially how that impacts the supply chain and the distribution of food.
Awesome. Okay, we'll toss it over to Dan.
Thanks, Tobin, and thanks to the students and faculty for organizing this. I'm really excited to be participating. Maybe I'll hit a couple other areas of interest to our fund. I'd say the ones that Phil described are of interest to us as well. A few others in thinking about the large seed chemical companies that have been around for a long time and selling those inputs to growers. I think a more recent trend that we're seeing is the increase in biological solutions for crop protection, crop stimulants, and other on-farm products. So this has happened at a time when small molecule chemistry has faced some major headwinds, glyphosate among those, related to safety profile of those products, consumer acceptance, regulatory, and what's resulted from that is that for large companies to try to bring new products in synthetic chemistry to market, you're talking about decades and hundreds of millions of dollars and major regulatory headwinds and an unclear outcome. Biological products, which encompass larger molecules like peptides, proteins, even live microbes, tend to have greater specificity to the target and therefore a better safety profile, as well as a faster regulatory path and greater consumer acceptance. So that's been an area where we've seen a lot of startups focusing, and also an area where it's not quite as capital intensive as some of those traditional products. So that also makes it possible for startups to potentially break through. We've got some investments in that category, like Vestron, for example, that's developing peptides as biopesticides, and Sound Agriculture that's also using kind of biological products as crop growth stimulants. There are certainly challenges in that category related to stability of the products, sometimes challenge storing them. Efficacy tends not to be quite as high as small molecule chemistry, which tends to be very effective in killing a lot of stuff. And so there are still challenges to be overcome, but that's an area of interest that we think is well aligned to some of the market trends. Another would be protein production, and I think Tom kind of hit on that a bit in the prior session, but alternative forms of protein production beyond raising animals, which would include biomanufacturing, using fermentation to produce animal proteins. We're an investor in a company called Geltor that's producing animal proteins, including collagen, via fermentation, and allows them to produce those ingredients without having to raise animals. Greater kind of functionality and consistency of the product based on the way that those products are made, and of interest to kind of growing parts of the market and kind of consumer interest. And then beyond that, a bunch of other categories in protein, from cultivated meat like Memphis meats, kind of fungal mycelium-based products like Nature's Find, which used to be sustainable bioproducts, insect protein, all sorts of other ways of producing protein that might have advantages related to nutrition and consumer acceptance, and in some cases kind of flavor and quality and those types of things. So I'll pause there and let Brett chat.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'll do, I guess one thing that you guys both touched on that I find interesting, and I think will, as more transparency continues to come in the food supply chain, I am curious how consumer behaviors and consumer trends will continue, how that will drive adoption and innovation all the way down to the farm level. And so, which, historically farmers kind of produced and pushed food, and here's what we have, this is your options. And it's flipped a bit where now consumers are pushing things, and you see that in the alternative protein space and a variety of other ways as well. And so I think that continuing to see the power that the consumer has to drive change all the way throughout the food supply chain is interesting, and is probably not a trend that's going to go away. So that's one that I kind of would add on to what these guys said, that I agree with both of what they said. I'll also touch quickly on the second part of your question, which was around what's the investor role. Hopefully, the investor role is to support great entrepreneurs, right, and help them in a meaningful way, and honestly, and many times just not get in the way of founders and not get in the way of entrepreneurs. But certainly to provide capital, Rolodex, mentorship and advice, and help provide some framework that founders can use to build big businesses. And so, that's, as an investor, that's the way I see my role, is to help where I can, help make introductions, help provide insights that I might have that they might not, but also to realize that it's a founder's company and they're the ones that are putting everything into it. And as long as they're listening and processing the advice that we're giving, understanding that they might not always follow it. And that's why we invested in them in the first place, was that, they're making bold decisions, and it might not necessarily agree with what I would do, but, we put our money to work with founders that we believe in and are trying to build big things. So they have to live with the decisions forever. I have a portfolio of investments, not just one.
Awesome. That's great. You all made really poignant points. And so kind of to build on what you just mentioned, Brett, in order to bring more great technologies to life, we need different sources of capital to invest in these startups and bring these ideas to market. So, venture capital can have a huge impact, but it can't do it alone. I guess I'm curious your guys' thoughts on what the role you see for venture capital and the other players that can provide the needed capital post-venture to get some of these disruptive solutions to scale. And we'll start again with Phil.
Yeah. So I think, Brett actually mentioned it and said it well, in that, there is a specific role, of the investor in the ecosystem. And I think, first and foremost, it's, finding the truly gifted, founding teams that are out there and investing, and really, investing with conviction in those teams. And when you invest with conviction, is when, you are truly, more than just your capital, invested in the success of the company and the project and the team. And you'll do anything, within your power in order to make that team successful as they grow. And so that comes by way of obviously investing dollars into the business so that it can, fund its, lack of profitability over the coming years, which is what it takes to build a venture capital, backed company. But in addition to that, there's a lot of guidance, but also great, very focused introductions to future team members, to potential customers, partners, downstream investors, and helping you kind of avoid pitfalls. Having seen a lot of companies go through similar challenges, that's one thing that an investor can do, is say, hey, I've seen this been done a dozen times, and this is what didn't work. This is what did work. That doesn't mean that's going to be what works or doesn't work this time, but it's worth having that information. So kind of arming, the founders with information, data of what's worked and what hasn't worked is something an investor can do. But I think in general, allocate, a job of a venture capital investor is to allocate capital, right? And our LPs are investing in us to, allocate that capital wisely. And so, I think in terms of the role of, an investor, in addition to all those things that I just said about helping the company, I think it's also, understanding the trends of in the market, in the industry, and where there is real opportunity for startups to, build a really interesting business that could scale to potentially $1 billion plus outcome. And so, we need to pay close attention, and we need to be in conversations with the right people that are knowledgeable about the spaces that we're investing in order to come at this with a really prepared mind. When we meet a really compelling founder, and understand is what they're doing, possible, and can it really scale to be a massive company over time. So that's a lot of what an investor does. Is you're getting pitched by thousands of entrepreneurs throughout the year, and for us, at least at Crosslink, we usually invest in about 10 or so per year. So it's you have to say no a lot, unfortunately, and you have to be very picky. And so in order to do that, you have to come at the entrepreneur with a prepared mind. I think an entrepreneur and a founder, it's really important for them to be selective as well as to who they speak with on the investor side. You want to talk to people that are actually interested in your space and what you're building, and those that tend to have a prepared mind and have maybe invested in that market, or at least spent a lot of time in that market, are much more likely to invest in your company and be helpful to your business as you grow it. So it's important that both sides are, very focused and picky as to who they're speaking with. But yeah, I mean, I think the important things for investor is, when you do invest, I think it really does come down to investing with conviction, and putting your heart and soul into the founding team and the company in order to help grow it and do everything you possibly can, and then get out of the way when things are going well. You got to know when to say, hey, I'm not going to be a distraction to the team, and know your place as an investor. You're not on the battlefield. You're not the operator. You're the investor. And so there's two different roles there that I think are important.
And to build on that, as a firm that is investing in early stage companies, I think our investment dollars can be effective in helping these founders further develop their products, demonstrate proof of concept, and hopefully validate product market fit. That said, often our dollars alone are unlikely to be sufficient to actually get to the finish line of significant growth, market capture, and scale. And so the way that we try to work is to help these founders move towards product market fit, demonstrate unit economics and the potential, and then partner with other sources of capital to help those companies grow. So that could be private equity firms, could be debt financing, equipment financing if there's significant CapEx involved, and even in some cases working with large companies. If you're a startup seeking to grow, it can be very challenging to, for example, if you're looking to sell directly to farmers, going to farm gate to farm gate is oftentimes a fraught sales process. And so tapping into larger companies that have established relationships, trust with customers, access to distribution, can bring a pathway to scale, as well as potential additional dollars if you're able to consummate agreements that come with upfront payments or royalties or whatever. So, this is I would say food and agriculture, perhaps compared to some other industry categories of venture capital, tend to have longer development timelines. And in some cases, depending on the technology, greater capital needs if you're thinking of like indoor farming or biomanufacturing. And so having a collection of like-minded investors that understand those aspects of the industry and that are patient and have the connections to bring together additional capital partners is really important.
And I think Dan actually touched on one of the questions that's trending in the Ask a Question section, which was like around how much capital intense, how are investors thinking about capital intense businesses right now, and is ag and food a more capital intense space? And it can be, right? There's also just pure enterprise SaaS solutions, right? Software solutions that are kind of equivalent of any other vertical or anywhere else. I think one thing that's can be unique about the food space is that oftentimes you're also dealing with perishable goods. So not only are you dealing with a physical product, but it's also oftentimes and can be perishable. And so there are also some interesting capital dynamics that can be associated with that. I think that I invest I'm pretty early. So I invest in pre-seed and seed stage companies, right? So I invest super early. And as far as, other sources of capital to help companies in the food vertical, I think that you're seeing, one thing that I'm seeing is like, if you look at like a region, like what's going on in Israel right now, there's a lot of government money that goes to seed companies even before venture capital will often step in. And there's been an incredible explosion of food tech startups in Tel Aviv, in and around Tel Aviv right now. I was there in January this year and met with 30 food tech startups that were all like building interesting things. And so you see there's a couple other regions, and that's just one specifically, where they put a focus on a vertical and have focused on the food tech vertical. And the government's putting money to work to seed companies in a way that we really don't do in the United States right now. And that's an important part of, early capital is just as an important part of the investment value chain as venture or growth equity or private equity or, subsequent later rounds. You also are seeing I think you're also seeing a movement of, it's almost the norm for some of the big enterprises in the food space to have funds of their own now. And it kind of went up and then it went down, and now it's kind of peaking again, where a lot of the big enterprise, we work with Cargill and Ecolab, and they have a program with us at Techstars, right? And while it's not direct investment, it's a way of investing in early stage startups on their part. And that's becoming more the norm rather than the exception, to be able to get strategic capital from somebody that is a huge player in the space. And so that's another source of capital that you're seeing fall in to the food vertical right now that really wasn't as active even 5 years ago in the space.
Awesome. You touched on how some segments are more capital intensive than others. And I guess I'm curious, what do you consider when you're investing in a startup that has the potential to be disruptive? And for that, what recommendations do you have for entrepreneurs? We'll kick it over to Dan. Or sorry, we'll start with Phil again. We'll keep it consistent.
Sorry, Dan.
That's all right.
I think you're always balancing, as an investor, you're always balancing the risk against the ultimate reward. What the end potential of the business is, and I think a lot of times within this industry in particular, it's a lot of vertical industries, but particular within agriculture and some others like manufacturing and supply chain, and some other kind of industries that require a lot of physical work in order to get their job done. I think within those categories, you do see a lot more capital intensive businesses. Within agriculture, I mentioned robotics, and we're an investor in a company called Ironox, which is building a full stack farm, and it's powered by robotics and autonomous machines in order to get that done and more efficiently and more scalably and reliably. And there's a whole list of things I can go on forever about. But I think that the key, though, is, we viewed that business. Obviously, there's a lot of additional risk points that come into evaluating a business that requires hardware, robotics, AI, software, all of which are capital intensive to build. But if the ultimate opportunity, which we view as massive, right? If they can solve the problem they're solving, which is to solve core elements of food security, fresh produce across the entire globe, removing linkages of the supply chain and logistics of shipping produce 2,000 miles before it's consumed. All of these things in our mind are huge opportunities. So we're constantly balancing, what's the upfront investment and risk that we're taking, and how do we think about that in terms of what the outcome could be over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And so when that balance meets in the way that it did when we made this investment, for example, and others, it just makes sense. And so, of course, it's always, for venture capital, it's always better to be able to fund startups with small amounts of capital early on in order to prove, whatever the minimum viable thing you need to prove is to get to unlock the next stage. And for internet or software businesses, that's less money. So you can invest, you can raise a few $100,000 or $1 million or a couple $1 million in order to get to your first set of milestones on a software business, whereas if you're building, robotics system, that's going to be pretty tough to do. But I think, like I said, it's about matching the, risk and reward and trying to, I think even if you are a capital intensive business, like a robotics business, I think, if you're able to prove, if you ever be very clear about what your milestones are over the next 12, 18, 24 months as a startup, and what unlocks that next leg of growth or that next stage as a company, and you communicate that extremely well to an investor, that helps that investor really understand what that risk is that they're taking and understand what the ultimate opportunity is if successful. So I think it does come down to being very, as a founder, being very prescriptive and dialed in as to what you're looking to achieve with the money, because ultimately the goal is all the same of whether you're building a capital intensive or not a capital intensive business. You want to get to a place where you have a sustainable, profitable, high margin business over time that can be defendable against competition, right? So all these companies are trying to get to the same place, and all the VCs that are funding those companies are trying to get to the same place. But there's going to be different journeys depending on what kind of business you're building is. So if you can communicate very effectively and you understand it, if you understand it, you can communicate it, which is, what are the different legs of that journey? What are the milestones you need to reach, and how much capital do you need to raise to get to that next stage very well? And it's clear and it's laid out. I think that helps de-risk your business a lot, and it helps, someone like me get pretty excited.
Yeah, and I think in thinking about our evaluation of startups and their potential to really break through, a big part of our assessment involves trying our best to deeply understand what the current state of the market is, and the current solutions that are in place that the startup might be attempting to disrupt. And I think we often see entrepreneurs that will say, well, that our solution is better for XYZ reasons, and all we have to do is get it in front of a customer and they'll understand all of these benefits and they'll buy it. But there can often be kind of non-obvious barriers that are in place in terms of overcoming skepticism of customers, integrating something new into their operations that could be a challenge to how their existing processes that makes it difficult to implement a new solution. And so, that for us involves a lot of discussions with our external network. We try to avoid the trap of having just our team sit around a table and attempt to do our best brainstorming and thinking. You've got to get outside of your walls and really understand who the potential customers are, what's driving, what are their criteria and priorities, understand the larger companies and what initiatives they might have underway, as well as kind of existing distribution channels. So it's a lot of talking to our external advisors, our corporate partners, and kind of others in our sphere. As far as kind of recommendations for entrepreneurs, again, I think understanding your customers is the most important thing, and where I see folks fall short sometimes is because they're not necessarily going to where their customers are, and spending time with them and seeing how their operations work and how a technology solution might fit into those operations or be added to them. And so I think being relentless about that customer research and how it drives iteration and product development, and continuing to stay close to those folks is really the most important thing. Because again, there are aspects of this industry that have been developed over decades, sometimes centuries, that are not easily switched with the snap of a finger.
And so I think that these guys both touched on some really good stuff. One thing to add to like the future financing risk piece of it, again, I'm super early, so I think a lot about future, and we have a small fund, so we can't carry a company from one stage to the next. I mean, I just can't do that. And so I do think about future financing risk when I make an investment. And one thing that an entrepreneur can do to really help that conversation is when they pitch me, let's say you're a seed stage company pitching me, and you say, hey, listen, this $1 million or $2 million or $3 million that we're raising right now, where it's going to get us is it's going to get us to this point here. And founders are pretty good at understanding the need projections and need to understand how they're going to deploy some capital and where it might go. And those projections are usually wrong, and that's okay. But what they're usually not good at doing is taking that next step, which is saying, and when we get to that point, it's going to allow us to do this. And only 3 things can happen after a round, right? Like you can run out of money and die, you can get the cash flow break even, or you can get to a point where you can raise another round of capital. And those are the only 3 outcomes when you raise one round of capital that can happen. And so if you pitch me and you say, okay, listen, we're raising $2 million now, but that $2 million is going to allow us to get to, if you're an enterprise SaaS company, $150K in monthly recurring revenue. And at that stage, that's kind of where A rounds are going off for our industry or our vertical. Shows you've done your research as a founder. It helps me de-risk. Like I have some thoughts in my head, and so I'm like, okay, like that makes sense. And so it kind of helps know that we're on the same page around de-risking the future financing risk, and that's regardless of vertical. Honestly. Yeah, so I think that's one thing a founder can do, and one thing that I do think about. I mean, and then to touch on Dan's point a little bit further, like I love founders that are obsessed with the pain point that they're solving. So like, what's an actual acute pain? It's the companies that have a harder time building it. One of my companies, I ran right into a brick wall because we were a nice to have product, not a must have product. And so I'm a little bit biased here, where it's hard and expensive, and you can do it, but it's hard and expensive to build a product that is a nice to have. It is much easier if the pain that you're solving with whatever you have is a real acute pain point that's felt across an entire organization that you're trying to sell to, from the person that uses the product to the decision makers that have to write the check, which are sometimes different people, right? And so I love it when founders are really thoughtful about that actual pain point that they're solving. And I care a lot about that too. And I have a very similar method to Dan, where I try and get out and call people that are the users of the actual thing, and the decision makers of the actual thing, to decide, like, is this a real pain point or not?
Awesome, great. And just as a quick follow-up to combine 2 of the Q&As that the audience has posted. So one is, do you look for shorter or longer timelines with AgTech investments versus others? And another question is AgTech more resilient than other tech investments? And so I guess if you could potentially respond to both of those in case they are intertwined.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. I think the time horizon question is a good one. I think it depends on it goes back to, it depends on the type of business, because like within ag tech there are there are direct consumer food businesses or CPG businesses that could be an extremely short timeline to get to meaningful revenue and profitability. There are software businesses that are selling SaaS solutions that again can be pretty capital efficient and get to real revenue very soon and grow pretty rapidly year over year. As long as you figure out the right go-to-market approach, which I think is a challenge within agriculture, which maybe we'll touch on a little bit. Is sales pipelines and sales cycles can look a little different, when selling to big agriculture or farmers or grocery stores, or depending on where you sit in the ecosystem. So that you got to be cognizant of that coming in. But then there's other businesses like I said, like robotics businesses or companies that require a lot of upfront investment. I'm sure biotech is a very similar dynamic. I don't invest in that category as much, but I think having that a long upfront investment cycle to get to a viable product you can sell is just going to push everything out, right? So you got to kind of think about it in terms of that. However, some of these capital intensive businesses that we've been discussing, they require a lot of upfront investment, but once you hit that breaking point, in the business where you can actually switch to being a sales-driven company from, kind of an R&D driven company early on, a lot of times you can see a pretty rapid, growth at that point, because you put in all the hard work of building something very unique up front that essentially once you build it and the economics make sense, it sells itself. And so these things can scale extremely quickly once you hit that point. So I think maybe it depends on the type of business, and some of these are going to have longer life cycles to get to a real traditional kind of revenue milestone that a lot of venture capitalists are used to seeing. So you have to be cognizant of that when thinking about downstream financing risk, which I think Brad said, and I absolutely think about when in investing in any company, and especially within ag tech, or if it's a more capital intensive business, is how can we ensure that we're still able to attract capital down the road. But yeah, we definitely take those things into account when investing. I mean, I think one thing that entrepreneurs always need to realize is a lot of times, venture investors, especially at our firm, we're looking at a lot of different types of companies in a lot of different sectors, right? And our job is to, allocate capital the best we can, for the highest potential return across all those different markets and business models and different things, right? So, you are competing against a pretty broad universe when you're talking to a venture investor, and so you really need to kind of get across why your business is so unique and can scale to such a big outcome, whether it be in 5, 10 years, 15 years, however long it takes. And so really having a good understanding of what that cadence can look like and where that hockey stick potentially is in the business is really important to get across, because it goes back to that, here's our milestone we're funding for. This is how much money it's going to take for us to get to these milestones. And then this is what the profile of the business looks like long-term.
Awesome. Just to jump in the last 5 minutes, I'd love to tackle 2 more questions. The first one, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on COVID. So COVID has highlighted a lot of gaps in our current agricultural system and accelerated the need for numerous ag tech solutions. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the impact of COVID is in kind of the short and long term. So I'll toss it to Dan to kick that off.
Yeah, I think some of the trends that have already been underway have the potential to be accelerated by COVID. So I'm thinking of like e-commerce, for example, as it relates to procurement of inputs. That'd be on the upstream side, and then certainly on the downstream side in terms of purchasing, where farmers as customers of inputs or consumers of customers of food products are increasingly making purchases online. They're getting better data transparency to make decisions, and that will be probably further accelerated by COVID. Things like robotics and automation, same thing. If you look at what's happening in a lot of meat processing facilities, that's being driven by a lot of people working shoulder to shoulder in confined spaces. And so to the extent that you can reduce labor requirements in those types of environments, again, things that food processors have already been working on related to food safety, as well as kind of production efficiency, I think those things will be further accelerated by COVID. So those are a couple right there. I'll let Phil or Brett jump in.
I mean, I think short run, right? It's everything is going to be, people are going to be focused internally at their own businesses and just making like shoring up their walls. So like the next couple months, still people are starting to have a little bit less hair on fire, and conversations are starting to happen already. Like now, you're starting to see people. I think big enterprises come out of the emergency, what the hell's going on phase of this. And so, but I agree completely. Actually, agree completely with Dan. I think that that COVID's going to drive the adoption curve for founders and entrepreneurs and innovation internally in the food system. So I actually think that it is going to drive adoption and potentially be real beneficial in a couple of the areas that he said, but also just honestly, something that Phil said earlier, like it's a relatively Excel-driven vertical. Like, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is done on Microsoft Excel or on paper in the food system. And so just driving adoption of technology that is focused on the digitization of the food system in one way, shape, or form. Like how come we're dumping out, tons of food and milk just because you can't get it from one place to the next? It's because it's really hard to change, to move the way the distribution model, the current distribution model of the food system is really tough to move on a dime, largely because it's not that digitized. It's not very modernized. And I think that people recognize that. It's now thrown in people's faces, and so it's going to drive the adoption of new innovation. Whether that innovation comes from entrepreneurs or big corporates, it's probably going to be a combination of both.
Yeah, I agree. I tend to think that dislocation, disruption, and massive changes in markets create really good opportunities for startups, to kind of come in. I think the COVID situation has amplified a bunch of the issues with the agriculture market that we're seeing when it comes to labor issues, labor shortages and requirement and need for automation and robotics in order to bring businesses into the next generation. That's amplified for sure. Talking about food safety and kind of traceability and being able to understand where food came from and its safety and security along the supply chain. That's amplified, and that's a great opportunity for startups and data businesses and whatnot. Volatility spikes in supply and demand. We're seeing major shifts in demand right now with grocery, and what's going on there. How do you respond to that as a grocery store or as a food supplier or a farmer? Very difficult, right? So I think these are all challenges these are all amplified challenges by COVID that are creating, that are showing and maybe exposing opportunities that already were there, for startups to go after. And maybe, in this kind of crisis situation, you'll see more of an appetite, from the buyers and the demand side of this equation, which could be a good thing for startups that are well positioned.
Awesome. That sounds good. In our last minute, kind of rapid fire, do any of you guys have an AgTech innovation that you're really excited about that has come out in the past couple of years, or is there something coming up in the next couple of years that you're really excited about?
I'll jump in. I think that we've talked a little bit about protein already today, and there's been a lot of attention given to Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods and others developing plant-based proteins. I think there will be, I'm interested in kind of the next generation of alternative proteins because there's still kind of nutrition and health drawbacks or even weaknesses to some of those products, but they have the advantage of being able to improve those products. And so thinking about some of these companies that are developing fungal root mycelium based food products, which doesn't sound that appealing as I say it, I think is interesting though, because you've got, you're starting something that's much more like a whole cut of meat versus, putting it through an extruder. And the texture has potential advantages as well. So I'm interested to see if those types of products that have some of those kind of meat alternative advantages from a branding and consumer perspective, but potentially better nutrition, see if those things break through.
Something that's been talked about. I am also really interested in robotics, and it could be a ways away from adoption and a longer return as an investor right now. But I am like a company that can go in and play a really important role in a meat manufacturing facility. That's would be really interesting. It's really hard to manufacture meat right now, and it's a very, very physical, tough environment to work in. So that's one spot. I also think that my one thing I always say in this is I've always been interested in somebody that is modernizing pest control, specifically rodents. So not necessarily on-field pests, but like where things are stored, where food is stored. So like I think there's some really interesting way. There's a founder out there that can figure out a really creative way to use robotics and artificial intelligence and all the software out there to disrupt the Orkin man, which has been the same for 150 years.
Yeah, I'll just double down on that. I think I've already kind of mentioned this a couple times, so I won't spend too much time on it. But I think, robotics, computer vision, AI, all of these technologies that have seen insane, strides in development and adoption in a lot of industries is just super well suited for agriculture and all the problems we're seeing with labor, supply chain, and food safety and traceability and all these areas. I think there's just a lot of opportunity. There's going to be multiple multi-billion-dollar companies built utilizing those technologies within agriculture.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, guys. This was a great chat. Really appreciate your time. Thank you to the audience as well. We've got some great panels coming up this afternoon and some pitches this evening, so stick around. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. It's fun.
Thank you. Thanks, Tobin.